Hello, and welcome to Talks on the Rock through Vashon Center for the Arts. I'm Rebecca Albiani. I give the art history lecture series through Talks on the Rock. And today it is my great privilege to talk about Kehinde Wiley. Against the backdrop of our current political situation, I thought it made sense to begin with Kehinde Wiley's most famous painting, the official presidential portrait now hanging in the National Portrait Gallery. I acknowledge that it's possible that there may be people in my audience today for whom a picture of President Obama surrounded by flowers does not produce a feeling of calm and well-being. And if that's you, that's okay. I'm glad you're here for this talk especially. It's important to note that this portrait is something of an anomaly within Wiley's work, as we'll see. He usually inserts anonymous, everyday men and sometimes women of color into these settings and poses of power that he finds in Western art from the Renaissance to the Gilded Age. But when, as he said, he was asked to go to the White House to interview for a gig in 2016, that gig was painting a black man who inhabited an unprecedented position of power on the world stage. Wiley's job was to convey the intelligence, the grace, and the humanity behind that power. And he found that he and President Obama had a number of things in common. They were both the children of an absent African father and an American mother, African American in Wiley's case. They both later traveled to Africa in an effort to understand their roots. They were both raised by single mothers, and they've both achieved spectacular success in their respective fields. Wiley chose to portray Obama seated, not towering above us, but sitting maybe a little uneasily on the edge of a hard Federalist-style chair. 8 years in office has put a lot of gray in his hair. And instead of adapting an existing patterned background as Wiley usually does, he created one out of symbolic foliage and flowers. African blue lilies refer to Obama's Kenyan father, jasmine to his childhood in Hawaii, and chrysanthemum is the official flower of Chicago. Now, Obama was not actually the first president to ask an African-American painter to make his portrait. The credit for that goes to Bill Clinton, who had Simi Knox paint his White House official portrait. But here are the last two official portraits. And then here is the Obama portrait. And the main thing that Obama did, his innovation, was to ask not a portrait painter, which is kind of a separate genre, but an artist, a fine artist, a respected conceptual artist who also happens to be one of our greatest painters of human skin to make his portrait. So these previous portraits, these men, powerful men in their suits and ties, are instantly forgettable as works of art, whereas the Obama portrait is indelible. It is an important work of art by an important artist, and it introduces a new generation of Americans to this artist and to the possibilities of an African-American artist succeeding at the highest levels. Kehinde Wiley does not paint self-portraits, although he invites us to look at the entirety of his oeuvre as kind of a surrogate self-portrait. This is about as close as he comes to inserting himself in the kind of portrait tradition that he places his sitters in. It's a photograph shoot that he did for the cover of Flaunt magazine. And one of the reasons that Wiley loves the glamour is that he did not grow up with it. As I mentioned, he was the son of a single mother, and he was raised in South Central Los Angeles. His mother put him and his twin brother in after-school art programs from a young age so that he would have a safe place to hang out after school while she was still working, a place that was not the streets. He succeeded very well at these after-school art programs, and they involved visits to museums, where Wiley was bowled over by the power of the Western painting tradition. He particularly loved the Huntington library and art collections with its portraits in the grand manner. So what we're looking at right now is the Thornton Portrait Gallery with Gainsborough's famous Blue Boy right there in the center, surrounded by other full-length 18th century portraits of the high and the mighty and the very, very wealthy from this period. And Wiley obviously immediately noticed that there was no room here for Black bodies. And to anyone who says all lives matter, I want you to look at spaces like this, at our cultural institutions, museums, the opera, the symphony, and so forth, which tend to be spaces that tell visitors white lives matter, and only white lives matter. So when you see a Black body in, say, British art from the 18th century, it's almost always a slave or a servant. And Wiley fell in love with oil painting, with this tradition, and yet wanted to criticize it as well for its lack of inclusion. And he said that it was horribly important to him when he was a teenager, a 16-year-old, and LA County Museum of Art purchased and hung this painting by Kerry James Marshall. Wiley, in fact, said, quote, "It literally changed my life," end quote, to see this painting on the wall at LA County Museum of Art. Because let's face it, a lot of American institutions have a sad history of purchasing the works of artists of color to say they have diversity in their collections, but not displaying them, particularly back in the 20th century. And Marshall's big painting, 10-foot wide image of a Black barber shop, this important cultural institution for the African American community, with its witty references to the history of art, the very title, De Stijl, referring to the Dutch modernist art group of the 1920s that Mondrian was part of. Well, this painting gave the young Kehinde Wiley so much hope and propelled him to an first a BFA, a Bachelor in Fine Arts, at the San Francisco Art Institute. And from there, he was selected into the highly prestigious, star-making Yale MFA program. And he said at San Francisco Art Institute, he really honed his craft as a painter, something that Kerry James Marshall did as well as he was a young artist, figuring that as a black artist, he had to be better. He had to have better chops than any white artist if he were to compete. Well, Wiley got his skills mastered in San Francisco. Then at Yale, that experience was more about theory, about ideas, about how to express gender, race, class in his works. And this is a work that he did while a graduate student at Yale from his conspicuous fraud series, where we see a black man in a suit like the ones that Bill Clinton and George Bush were wearing. Obama conspicuously left off that tie. But this black man does not look comfortable in his suit, in his skin, in his hair. His hair, in fact, has taken over the canvas, his unruly hair that has spread across into these tendrils that are constraining him, keeping him in his place. And this work addresses that feeling of black professionals that they do not belong on Wall Street or in the spaces of American capitalist power. Also at Yale, Wiley made a video which he revisited in 2016, and I think this is from the 2016 version. But in it, he approached young black men and asked them to come to his studio to be recorded on video smiling for an entire hour. And at a certain point, when they couldn't smile anymore, he would sub in a different face, smiling. There were 17 people that took part in this. But when we look at these smiles, we see that if you try to smile for an hour, if you try to smile for 5 minutes, it starts to get forced. And this is also about the experience of being a black male in a majority white culture that is deeply imbued with white supremacy, and having to smile, having to be nice and polite and unthreatening, and the toll that takes psychologically on these sitters. Well, after Yale, Wiley was offered a residency. He was the artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And Harlem was a completely different atmosphere from Yale, from New Haven, but also from South Central LA. Because, as a famous 80s song put it, nobody walks in LA. But on the streets of Harlem, Wiley found all of these attractive African-American men peacocking, as he put it, in their best clothes, strutting around, having this place, this venue for their sense of style. And Wiley wanted to make that part of his art. But also in Harlem, he found on the street a discarded mugshot. So he didn't paint it in 2002. He didn't paint it until a few years later, which we see here. But he took that mugshot and he pinned it up on his studio wall. And it made him begin to think about portraiture, that tradition that he loved from the Gainsboroughs and the Reynolds, from the Huntington. But that tradition which excluded people that looked like him. And he thought that for many African Americans, the only official portrait that would ever be made of them was, in fact, a mugshot. And so eventually he did paint this mugshot, this somewhat forlorn-looking young man with his own sense of style. We get the multiple necklaces around his neck, the wife beater, but it's a beautiful portrait of someone that Wiley found randomly on the street, not peacocking, but in this humiliating position of a discarded mugshot. And Wiley also knew that he was not the first artist to approach this material, that Andy Warhol, too, had used mugshots in his art. This is Warhol's #1, John M., from his Most Wanted Men series. And like Wiley, Warhol was an openly gay man. So there's a double entendre in the Most Wanted Men. Yes, they're wanted by the FBI, but they're also quite desirable, as of course is Wiley's young mugshot individual. And I believe that Warhol is a fundamental touch point for Wiley. The way that Warhol established a studio, the way that he used not just mugshots, but pop culture as a way to subtly critique the society of his time. After his studio museum show, Wiley was deluged with offers of gallery representation. And he chose the Jeffrey Deitch Gallery that staged his first one-person show in 2003. The ceiling work is called Go. The show was called Faux Real. With the faux spelled F-A-U-X, a pun on for real. And there were candles, candelabras. Wiley's openings were always spectacles. And we have this painting, and unfortunately the laser pointer doesn't really work, but you can see it. We have this ceiling painting that is like the ceiling of a church or a European palace. But instead of saints and angels and the royal family, we get, 5 young black men, one of whom we only see the feet of. They are painted in that traditional way that European artists have painted ceiling paintings that have us imagine that we are looking up into a ceiling. So we see the bottoms of feet, we see legs, and so forth. But he's playing with these very large conventions of European apotheosis painting, but putting ordinary young men. And he began to find these young men first on the streets of Harlem, and then Brooklyn, where his studio was, through a process that he calls street casting. He would watch the parade of attractive young men until he found one that he felt deserved to be monumentalized in paint. And he would approach them and start a conversation, and eventually would have them come to his studio to be photographed, but they would look through art history books. And in collaboration with the sitter, they would pick out a pose from some painting from Western art. Here it's female prophet Anne, who observes the presentation of Jesus in the temple. So the original is this elderly woman struck with awe because she realizes she's looking at her savior. In Wiley's case, it's a man in a Broncos jersey, which has its colors then moved into the background, the glowing mandala-like background, but he's looking up with that same kind of rapture. One of Wiley's most famous paintings he did in 2005 in his Rumors of War series. It's Napoleon leading the army over the Alps. And if you recognize the pose, that's because you probably know the source material, Jacques-Louis David's painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps from 1801. You can see here, and there are several versions of this portrait, but this is the one that Wiley's using as his source material. You can see how closely he transfers some of the original. So the horse is very, very similar. That charging stallion, black and white with the, put this down, it's not working, black and white with the curving tail and fiery eyes. The pose of the figure astride the horse, calm and masterful. The yellow cape, this very dramatic cloak that Napoleon wears in David's image of imperial power and military prowess. We also get these rocks in the foreground marked with the names of Bonaparte and the previous crossers of the Alps, Charlemagne and Hannibal. And Wiley adds Williams, the surname of his sitter. We see, though, that Williams is dressed in completely contemporary garb, but that it, too, is military garb. He's wearing camouflage, but not because he's in the military. No, he's wearing camouflage because it's a fashion statement. He's wearing Timberland boots as well. He's wearing a wristband instead of a gauntlet, and he has that sword, which reminds us that a black man is not allowed to carry a sword or any kind of weapon. He's already seen as enough of a threat by white America as it is. But here, within the world of this painting, he can wield a sword. Now, the background that Wiley uses is taken from the decorative arts of this period, that empire style, and it's kind of wallpapery pattern. But Wiley has embellished it because this painting is about, it is about a different way of looking at black masculinity, but it's also about toxic masculinity, about this desire for conquest. So Wiley has embellished the background with thousands of tiny sperm to make fun of that toxic masculinity. You can see that he's designed his own frame for this work as well, and there are even sperm in the gilded sculptural elements of the frame. And here too, Wiley is drawing on art history, thinking about Edvard Munch and his Madonna with these sperm swimming around the edges of its frame. The equestrian portrait of the Count Duke Olivares, a work by Velázquez, is another one in that series. And Wiley said when he was working on it, he actually had horses come to his studio, and he learned that the proportions of human to horse were not accurate in the European painting tradition, that horses are much bigger than they are shown by Velázquez and David and so forth. So he had to use Photoshop to adjust the proportions of his sitters and his trained Hollywood horses. He said that one of his favorite paintings, a painting he says he absolutely adores, is this Chancellor Séguier on horseback from 2005, from this Rumors of War series. And it is a reworking of Charles Lebrun, the official painter to Louis XIV, his Chancellor Séquier at the entry of Louis XIV into Paris, a 1660 painting of power. So this man is astride a horse, but surrounded by his courtiers who are holding parasols above him, so he's not threatened by any sun or rain. And we get these young men, beautiful young men, paragons of the French ideal of masculine beauty circa 1660, with all of their bows on their shoes. And, they're wearing kind of lovely red-heeled shoes and all of their brocade and gold. And Wiley turns that into this modern scene where it looks like he's got Williams posing again there in his camos, where he puts a young black man on that horse, an ordinary man, a man who is not looked up to. He's not elevated in our society. He's not in any kind of position of power. And yet here he is in this enormous, wonderful Wiley painting, surrounded by other men. And one critic said that he was behind a group of middle schoolers when he was seeing this painting for the first time in an exhibit, and wondered what their reactions would be. They were mostly African-American middle schoolers, and the girls were discussing which of the guys was hottest, whereas the young men were discussing the fashion, the brands, the fashion sense of these young men, which Wiley knows really, really well. And so it's this way of making something that is so stuffy and so white relevant for the 21st century for a diverse audience. And I just had to throw this photo in because I think it's so hilarious. And a lot of Wiley's paintings are funny, but Wiley here painting on a horse in his studio. In 2006, he painted this portrait of Andries Stilte the second for an exhibit at the Columbus Museum of Art, where he chose images from that collection to be his source material. So in this case, it's a 17th century Dutch portrait, and quite a small one by Johannes Verspronck. But we can see the arrogance of the pose. This is what we call the Renaissance elbow. It was a pose that's developed in the 16th century, a pose of masculine power and domination. We see also the walking stick and the way that Wiley's model bumps it up even more, tilting his head back and looking down at the audience. And remember, this is going into a museum. And most young black men don't get the opportunity to look down on, say, an opening night crowd of mostly white, wealthy, older Americans. Now, in 2006, when he painted this, Wiley heard that there was an opportunity to have a studio in Beijing. And he traveled to Beijing, fell in love with a Chinese man, learned Chinese, and established a studio in Beijing. And in Beijing, one of the things that attracted him was he was still painting people of African descent, but he got a different idea of what it was like to be of African descent in China than in the United States. Most of the people that were his models in China were in the service industry. And instead of the Western paintings, he used propaganda images from the 20th century, from Chinese communist sources, like this one. The original source material was a propaganda poster marked, "Acting in accordance with Chairman Mao's instructions means victory." And obviously his sitter is in on the joke. He's grinning broadly as he holds up the book of Chairman Mao's instructions. But that studio in Beijing allowed Wiley to have very highly trained assistants to help him with, for instance, the backgrounds of his work, which you can see here is taken not from Western decorative art, but from Chinese decorative art. And that has been something that Wiley has been criticized for. In fact, you can go on Rush Limbaugh's website and find the portrait of Obama with "Made in China" stamped on it, that Wiley outsourced his painting. But the fact is that all modern painters who work on that scale that Wiley works on use assistants. Here are a couple of Jeff Koons' assistants working on one of his paintings. But if you're working that large, whether you are Jeff Koons or Raphael or Rembrandt or Rubens, you have assistants doing the less important parts of your work. It's simply not a reasonable use of Wiley's time for him to do the stippling on the fruit, for him to paint all these tiny gold leaf patterns in the background of his works. And the problem is that nobody is criticizing Anselm Kiefer for using assistants. It's historically been an argument that is applied to people who are trying to break into the predominantly white male art world. So, for instance, for those of you on Vashon, I was supposed to do a talk in March on American female neoclassical sculptors in Rome, working in the mid-19th century. And one of those women, Harriet Hosmer, when she displayed her triumphant Zenobia in chains, was attacked in the media for not doing her own carving. She did the model for this. She worked it up in wax or terracotta, but then her studio assistants did the actual carving. But the thing was that every American sculptor working in Rome worked exactly that same way. None of the men were being called out for using assistants. Only the woman was being accused of not doing her own work. And there's a long history of that among women artists and now among African-American artists like Wiley as well. So Wiley says, yes, I use assistants, but that should not discredit me. That just means I am a 21st century artist acting the way that other 21st century artists do. And you don't think Mickalene Thomas pastes on every one of those rhinestones, do you? Wiley went from Beijing. He found that experience of exploring blackness in Beijing so interesting that that was a springboard for him to begin to explore blackness all over the world. And so this is a work that he made in Senegal. It's a, well, this is a small-scale work that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art circa 1800, the Dogon couple at the bottom, but there's actually a larger public sculpture of it. But Wiley here is taking his models from a community where it is extremely unusual not to be brown-skinned. And so his African world stage Africa paintings are more about gender and sexuality than they are about race, because these people are black in a world that is black. And yet they may be gay in a world where it could be very dangerous to be homosexual. It is illegal in many African countries to engage in homosexual acts. And Wiley shows us these two young Senegalese men that are in the poses of the heterosexual couple in the African sculpture. And so these are works about gender fluidity, about expression of friendship, or maybe more than friendship in African society. So Wiley began to work all over the world. This pair, or this enormous double portrait is of two young men that he met in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil as he expanded his practice to Brazil. And they chose to be depicted as two fallen heroes in a well-known public monument dedicated to a pioneering Brazilian aviator, Alberto Santos Dumont. So you can see this is the base of that statue there at the bottom, and the two young men depicted as as fallen heroes, but allying themselves with a powerful and heroic figure from Brazilian history. But they are reclining. And in the history of Western art, we have lots and lots of reclining female nudes, but not so many reclining male figures, nude or not. And Wiley began to make these enormous canvases, well over life size. This one is 300 inches wide, so that's 25 feet, I think. These are really, really big paintings. They are unignorable. And this one's called Woman Bitten by a Snake. In French, from its source material, which is the Auguste Clésinger sculpture that you see at the bottom. So in both of these, he's not using a painting, but rather a sculpture to remix into his own painting. So Wiley has a young black man in jeans that are pulled down so that we can see his Hanes underwear. He's wearing his sneakers, but they are positioned in the same way as the soles of the feet of the woman in the sculpture. Both of these works are erotic in nature. And when Wiley talks about his street casting process, he says that it's about desire, but it's not a sexual desire, it's an aesthetic desire. It is what humans does he see as, does he desire to memorialize in paint larger than life on gallery and museum walls. And he says that these works have a religious component as well, that they are about rapture. This feeling of rapture, which we know from Bernini and his Saint Teresa in Ecstasy, can be both a very carnal and a very religious, transcendent experience. Now, in 2009, Wiley had the opportunity to paint his first real celebrity. And that was Michael Jackson, who saw his Rumors of War show at the Brooklyn Museum and wanted his own portrait, equestrian portrait, in the grand European style. This was the very last portrait that Jackson ever commissioned of himself. He died before it was completed. But he never met Wiley face to face. He supplied photographs, but they had a lively debate over what they were going to use for their source material. They were thinking Rubens, and Michael Jackson got into, well, are we thinking late Rubens brushstrokes or early Rubens? And the source material they chose was a portrait of Philip II, a posthumous, interestingly, a posthumous portrait of Philip II in armor on horseback, being crowned by fame. And although the armor is almost stroke for stroke identical to the Rubens, Wiley makes some really interesting changes here. So the horse, obviously, is very different. And again, we get the scale difference. That would have been a larger horse Philip II would have been on. But Wiley's horse is more dramatic, more flamboyant. And it is a horse that begins brown, if you look at its rear legs, and gradually becomes white as you get closer and closer to its face. And famously, Michael Jackson underwent multiple plastic surgeries and bleaching procedures to get his face less black, more white. Instead of a voluptuous woman crowning him, Wiley has two putti, two cherubs, one black, one white. And the fact that the children are crowning him is a little creepy, given what we know about Jackson's predilections. There is also a flamboyant group of poppies right in front of the foreleg of the horse. And poppies create opium, which was the substance that led to Jackson's death. So there are things in here that I don't know if Jackson would have approved of had he lived to see the final version. But they are the changes that Wiley makes to the original Rubens portrait are very, very telling psychologically about their subject. Now, the next year, he depicted someone who is less well known to us, perhaps, but just as big an international star, Samuel Eto'o, the great footballer or soccer player from Cameroon. And they had a bit of a language barrier, but they communicated in French and Spanish. And the cult of celebrity that surrounded these soccer stars that Puma had hired Wiley to paint portraits of was something really astonishing to Wiley, something very different even than the celebrity surrounding someone like Michael Jackson. The world stage works moved to Israel in 2011, where Wiley was interested in meeting Ethiopian Jews who were involved in hip-hop. And it's the globalization that interests Wiley, the fact that all over the world, young men of African descent are taking this art form of hip-hop that originated in New York City, in America, and adapting it to their own circumstances, their own cultures and societies. And here, for his Israel portrait, he used Mizrah, Jewish paper cut designs for his background, and he found that although he got them and manipulated them through Photoshop, but he got them off the internet, many of the sources that he used were right in the Jewish Museum in New York City. And so eventually he was able to show his world stage Israel portraits with the original Mizrah paper cuts from the collection in the same exhibition. It was very exciting for him. Now, you might have noticed that up until now, we are only seeing men in Wiley's work. His first collection of paintings that was entirely devoted to women was called An Economy of Grace and painted in 2012. And this work you might remember if you saw the New Republic exhibit at Seattle Art Museum a few years back. It is a big, powerful painting called Judith and Holofernes. And for this series of works, Wiley did his usual street casting in Brooklyn, but because a man asking women, you want to come up to my studio, seemed to charged, he had one of his female white studio assistants accompany him and vouch for his bona fides that helped him to approach these wonderfully stylish young women on the streets of Brooklyn and asked them if they wanted to pose for him and be painted in this way. And for this series, they are not wearing their own clothes. He collaborated with Riccardo Tisci at the couture house of Givenchy, and Tisci designed dresses, fabulously expensive, gorgeous couture dresses for these women to pose in. And for this painting, the woman chose to be depicted in the guise of the biblical heroine Judith. And this caused a lot of stir when Wiley was selected to paint Obama, because this Judith is holding the severed head of a white woman. And so the right wing went nuts. Obama's portrait painter advocates black violence against white people. But this is a topic within art history. When this work was shown at Seattle Art Museum earlier this year, there wasn't an outrage saying, Sam advocates women chopping off men's heads, violence against men. No, that's ridiculous. Rather, this is a biblical scene about an Israelite heroine whose people were facing extinction, defeat by an Assyrian general, and so she wormed his way into his confidence and struck off his head with his own sword. And it's a very popular subject in Renaissance and Baroque painting. This one takes a Baroque source material with Judith holding that head. But it's a white woman's head. Is this about violence against women? No. This painting is about the norms of female beauty, which have been, in our culture, overwhelmingly white. So now you can buy dolls that are not white. But when I was growing up, that was very rare. And psychological studies have shown that even people of African descent have been programmed to prefer images of white people, to find them more attractive. And so what this woman is cutting off is not an actual head, and there's no blood here. We saw there's lots of blood in the Artemisia, but rather the idea that white women have a lock on beauty, on grace, on elegance. This woman, who is supremely elegant in her Givenchy dress, is cutting off that notion that blondes have more fun, that the white standard of beauty is the only one that counts. And Wiley depicts her, as this monumental and powerful and very beautiful figure. He would do some small-scale works based on Memling. And actually, this work is no longer attributed to Memling. It is now attributed to Quentin Metzys. But these are based on 16th century, 15th century devotional paintings, Northern Renaissance paintings. And again, Wiley is trying to bring ideas of rapture, of religiosity into his images of African Americans. Because just as they are not depicted as landowners or kings and queens in the European portrait tradition. Neither are African Americans or people of African descent depicted as saints within Western religious painting. And I particularly like this one that Wiley calls King and the High Priest. He gives us the name of his model, Kellen Scantlebury, written right on the frame that Wiley himself designs, but he shows him holding up an art history book. And we can see very clearly Raphael's Saint Cecilia altarpiece is the work that is there in his hand. So this shows us Wiley's process of introducing his sitters to the history of Western art, of leafing through volumes of Raphael, of Franz Hals, of David, of Gainsborough, and finding poses that speak to these young men. But here I love that he includes the book as well, and really introducing them to the history of art. A lot of Wiley's backgrounds from the last few years have been derived from the work of William Morris, the great designer. And this is a portrait of Lady Mary Hill, Lady Killigrew. The source portrait is 17th century. Morris's work is 19th century. So he's not using decorative arts that belong to this original sitters period, but rather to a famous figure of Western arts and crafts and design, but someone who was a socialist. And Wiley has said that his work is, he said, quote, "Let's face it, I make really high-priced luxury goods for wealthy consumers," end quote. But that is an echo of William Morris's lament, quote, "I spend my life ministering to the swinish luxury of the rich," end quote. And I think that Wiley's use of Morris is very, very deliberate. Now, the work that you can see at SAM when it opens again is Wiley's St. Anthony of Padua. So another case in which he's using a religious painting, not a portrait, as his source material, but showing us this young man, attractive young man in a military-style jacket. One of the patches on his jacket is the Black Panther patch worn by the U.S. Army's 66th Infantry Division in World War II, but that also reminds us of the Black Panther Party from the late 1960s. Wiley's branched out more recently into sculpture, and this work was at Seattle Art Museum, this 2014 work that he calls Bound, in which we see 3 busts of beautiful, self-composed women of African descent whose hair is all intertwined, intertangled. And with this work, Wiley takes on something of the hair culture of women of African descent, of the braiding, of the extensions, of the hours and hours spent in special salons that cater to their needs, and what a cultural milieu this is for millions of women. And in addition to sculpture, he began to work in stained glass as well. So he doesn't actually make the glass, he outsources that. But he designs the stained glass. And this one he calls Mary, the Comforter of the Afflicted. So he was using a Pietà image as his source material. And we've all seen Michelangelo's Pietà, where the dead Christ lies in Mary's lap as she mourns. And here we get not a dead Jesus, but we get a dead black child. Something that we are all too familiar with, from drive-by shootings, from police violence against the black community. There are too many black youth dying before their time. And he is carried not by a woman, but by a man with dreadlocks who doesn't have that look of serene peace on his face. He looks like he cannot, he can barely take this weight. He cannot take any more of this suffering. And around are figures that allude to the history of slavery in this country, the history of oppression, and also perhaps to hope for the future. But Wiley wants us all to feel that feeling of what it must be like to have your dead child put back into your hands. He wants us all to feel the feeling of the African American parents who have to tell their children how to be so careful if they're ever approached by the police, for instance. And he is sometimes criticized for not having enough social content in his works. But here it's very explicit, as it is in his public sculpture, The Rumors of War, which he made last year, which is a very timely work as our country was convulsed by protests for and against the removal of Confederate monuments, predominantly in the South, but through all of the United States as well. And this particular one is modeled on a Confederate statue of General J.E.B. Stuart. And he was killed in a battle or after a battle in the Civil War, but he was fighting on the wrong side. He was fighting to uphold slavery and the Southern way of life. And Wiley replaces the white Confederate general with a black man who sits comfortably astride that horse, holding the reins, glancing back over his shoulder. He's at perfect ease. His horsemanship is superb. He's wearing ordinary clothes, torn jeans, and a hoodie. And that hoodie has become a symbol, particularly of Trayvon Martin, but a symbol of the costume of black youth. And it is this image of power. And Wiley said, quote, "I want this to be about black men and their place in this society, a society that can say yes to black men," end quote. The mayor of Richmond noted, quote, "It's taken more than 100 years, but the rest of Richmond residents finally have a monument of a man on a horse that looks like them,"
end quote. And Wiley has said that he'd like to see more empty plinths where Confederate memorials once stood. He has been doing a series he calls Ship of Fools, based on the Narrenschiff tradition within Northern European painting, like the Hieronymus Bosch that we see here. But he said that he wants to push out of his comfort zone and into the irrational with paintings like Ship of Fools, which I'll show you a detail of, where instead of the patterned background or a landscape, we get the ocean, this shifting territory that reminds us with these African-American figures of the Middle Passage, of the slave trade. And also, you can see in the very background on the right, a three-masted ship on the horizon, but it reminds us of Winslow Homer. Works like the Gulf Stream and the power of the ocean and the smallness of the individual. And Wiley has also done a 3-channel video on this topic as well. This is another of his 2017 works, a portrait that is taken from a work by John Singer Sargent. And Wiley has said that he wants his work to speak to someone who knows the whole history of art and knows the theory and can get all of the allusions. But he wants it equally to speak to that kid, that child of color who walks into a museum for the first time and can see someone in a body like his or hers there on the wall. And Wiley's work does this again and again. In 2019, he went to Tahiti to critique the work of Gauguin. Instead, he did a group of paintings of Tahiti's Mahu community who identify as a third gender between male and female. So these paintings speak to the transgender community as well, and intergender, and the various shades of LGBTQ plus that Wiley is a proud part of that community. In 2020, Wiley has gone from strength to strength. Early in this year, his Napoleon crossing the Alps was shown together with the Jacques-Louis David in an exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum. And Wiley has opened an artist's residency of his own in Dakar, in Senegal. He had a Senegalese architect design this absolutely gorgeous modernist structure where he has a studio and he has studio space for 3 other artists who will be there for from 1 to 3 months, and they'll have the opportunity to learn French and Wolof and to participate in the artistic life of Dakar, as well as to deepen their own practice. Wiley himself chose to sit through the pandemic in his Dakar studio. And earlier this year, he had an exhibit at the William Morris Gallery in London, which is not in the city of London, the heart of London, but in a more diverse part of London. This is his portrait of Quanah Noble. And he had Londoners pose for him, men and women. And this one is being consumed by the wallpaper, the yellow wallpaper, an allusion to Charlotte Perkins Gilman's semi-autobiographical novel. But she poses with so much self-possession against this backdrop, which is drawn from a Morris and Company design, but honeysuckle, one that Wiley surely knows was designed not by William Morris, but by his daughter, May. So it's this instance of foregrounding an underrepresented population. And again, we see the background really starting to consume her. And for Wiley, I think that means that whereas 17th century aristocrats would pose with their lands in the background or a battle or something they owned, for modern people of color, sometimes their background threatens to consume them, to hold them back. I want to end by considering another of the criticisms of Wiley, that he is a sellout, that he that he's a one-trick pony, and he's just become this darling of the art world, and he just churns out these paintings one after the other. And I hope that I've shown with the sculptures and the Narrenschiff that he is not a one-trick pony, that he is moving into new and different directions. But I think it's important to remember what he said his project was. He wanted his works to speak to the art historians, but also to the African-American boy who's never been in a museum before and wants to feel welcome, wants to feel like there are people that represent him on the wall. And Wiley cannot accomplish that without getting his paintings into museums, which is a spectacularly difficult thing for a contemporary artist to do. And yet Wiley has managed to get his work before the public eye, to become, yes, something of an international superstar, but to succeed in reaching young people and inspiring young people in a way that he couldn't if he did not become an art world celebrity. In his St. George, he uses yet another William Morris background. And here, I think it reminds us of Morris's most famous pronouncement, quote, "I do not want art for a few, any more than education for a few, or freedom for a few," end quote. And Wiley has that same goal. He doesn't want art to be restricted to the very wealthy. He doesn't want art to be restricted to the whites. He wants art to be inclusive, to include people that look like him, and to include them not as servants, not as gangbangers in a Hollywood drama, not in the negative portrayals that we often get in the media, but to include them as heroic individuals, like his St. George here, who looks perhaps like he's giving us a Black Power salute, but if you look more carefully, he's actually wielding a sword. Wiley's paintings say that they deserve to be on museum walls. He's done the work. He's learned to paint like an old master, and yet has all the modern ideas about gender and culture that are important to contemporary art making. And in his paintings, Wiley can say, Black is powerful. Black is beautiful. Black lives matter. Thank you. So I can take questions, whether you are watching this on Facebook or on the Vimeo thread. If you can leave questions in the comments section, they will be fed to me. I don't know if there are any, but I can go there. And thank you to everyone who contributed to Vashon Center for the Arts to watch this live stream. And thank you all for watching, even if you didn't contribute. But it's really important in this day and age to support our arts institutions while we cannot be there in person. So I'm just checking to see if there are any comments or questions, and no, there are not. Allison, anything from Facebook? No? Well, thank you all for being here. Take care of yourselves. Wear your masks. Keep your distance. Be smart. And I look forward to the day when I can have an audience that is not made out of paper cutouts of individuals, but of real, live, breathing people. Thank you.